Good afternoon and welcome and hello to those of you who are joining us virtually. Welcome to the Niskanen Center's event on the history and the future of the child tax credit. My name is Ted Gayer, president of the Niskanen Center. And for those who are not familiar with us at the Niskanen Center, we develop and advocate policies that provide widespread opportunity, security, and opportunity, and prosperity, security, and opportunity. We believe that achieving these goals requires a strong and effective public sector and a dynamic and competitive private sector, which not surprisingly is why the child tax credit is such a large focus of ours. Child tax credit is the most successful policy lever to lift millions of children out of poverty. It also provides social insurance to American families, which helps support and protect economic freedom and market dynamism. This year marks two significant anniversaries for the child tax credit. 35 years ago, Congress and President Reagan created a bipartisan National Commission on Children. They tasked its members, quote, to bring national attention and to devise national solutions to profoundly troubling problems confronting America's children and families, end quote. Led by Senator J. Rockefeller of West Virginia, it came to be known as the Rockefeller Commission. One of the commission's most important recommendations was a bold new proposal, our universal child tax credit. While anti-poverty advocates supported the idea, Congress was concerned at that time about the cost and with the credit's refundability. As a result, a decade would pass before Congress would make its first down payment on this recommendation. So today we also mark the 25th anniversary of the country's first child tax credit passed with bipartisan support as part of the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997. The new credit was neither universal nor as generous as the commission's vision, but subsequent bipartisan efforts incrementally expanded its reach and its generosity. So the plan for today, our first panel, will look back at the commission's recommendations. Most elements of those early debates are still remarkably relevant today. After that panel, we'll take a break. We will then hear from several members of the next generation of family policy thinkers about where the child tax credit goes next. And after that, I invite you all to continue the conversation in the reception that follows. But before we begin, I want to thank our supporters who make this work possible. You can find their names acknowledged in the program that's on your desk in front of you. And a special thank you to our friends at the Rockefeller Foundation for allowing us to use this terrific space for today's event. And my thank you. So thank you again to the Rockefeller Foundation for hosting us in this space today. We're grateful to Danielle Gunan and her Rockefeller Foundation colleagues, both in New York and in Washington, for extending a warm welcome to us and for helping us organize the proceedings today. As guests of the Rockefeller Foundation in their space, we are prohibited from engaging in lobbying at all times during the event. Participants and panelists are, of course, permitted to discuss and serve as resources for information that can help inform the public, the media, and policymakers important issues of public policy. A request I hope you will join me in respecting. Finally, I want to acknowledge two members of our social policy team at Niskanen, whose hard work and vision have brought us together today, Tara Durari and Josh McCabe. Tara has done a fantastic job behind the scenes working to bring this event together, so thank you so much, Tara. And Josh is a recent addition to our team as a family policy senior analyst. His 2018 book, The Fiscalization of Social Policy, How Taxpayers Trump Children, The Fight Against Child Poverty, tells the story of the debates that we're having today and the research that inspired today's event. So thank you, Josh. And with that, I'm looking for Josh.
Over here.
Josh, I'll turn it over to you to set up the first panel and take it away. So thank you so much, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Ted. You're right. I am a very enthusiastic historian of the child tax credit. I spent a lot of time in the archives trying to figure out the history of the child tax credit, the documents, events that led up to negotiations. And all of our panelists this afternoon figured prominently in those debates. So I retrace how Gene's work at the Treasury, documenting how much the value of defendant exemption has been eroded by inflation in the post-war period, was picked up by the Reagan administration, influenced the 86 tax reforms, and then Gene shifted to a anti-poverty, pro-work, pro-marriage case for a child tax credit that influenced the National Commission on Children. I read Bob's letter, who's then president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, very prescient letter to President-elect Clinton, urging him to prioritize full refundability above all else in the 90s. And Elaine's work made me stop and think about the growing maze of family tax benefits, figure out what's the best way forward to help families. So together their insights on how to structure child tax credits to address poverty, marriage and work penalties, complexity, and a host of other challenges have shaped its trajectory, I think, for the better. So it's a real treat for me to be sitting with them here in person today to reflect on those contributions and offer their insights into the child tax credit short-term and long-term reform trajectory. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists and we'll dive into it. So we have Eugene Sterling, who's the Richard B. Fisher Chair at the Urban Institute. Bob Greenstein, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Elaine Magg, senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. So I'm a good historian, so I'm going to go in chronological order of the story. So we'll start with Gene. It's a long historical trajectory. It predates 1997, which predates the National Commission on Children. Can you give some background into sort of the history of the child tax credit, how it fits in with this broader focus on tax provisions affecting families and children in the tax code?
Well, thank you, Josh. I'm really honored to be on this panel with all three of the three people. I greatly respect, especially in this area, but beyond that, just as individuals. I want to concentrate my brief introductory remarks on two major issues, plus I really do what Josh has set it up. The most important one that I think of in terms of the child credit is, should children themselves be a priority in the budget? It seems to me you have to answer that question first before you answer the question of whether the child credit is the best way to achieve that result. The second question that I want to address very briefly is, what are the major purposes of the major tax provisions that affect children as reflected in their history? And those provisions are mainly the dependent exemption, the earned income credit, and the child credit, which are the tax provisions that resulted in what Josh you capably represented as the fiscalization of social policy. So let me start with the federal budget as a whole. This graph here reflects the trends over the last almost 15 years in terms of real spending on children. It's part of a much longer series study that we do annually at the Urban Institute, started over 10 years ago, called Kids Share. By the way, I do have a couple sign-up sheets here for my column if you're interested, but if you're also interested in being sure that you're on the annual release of this study, let me know and mark that on there. But if you look closely at this graph, you can see this huge spike in spending, particularly in tax provision. I realize that some of the details are going to be harder for some people, perhaps online, to see. But basically, the spike in total spending, and particularly the tax provisions, occurred during COVID. There's also a spike, by the way, that occurs, you can't quite tell it in the graph, that occurred in 2008 through 10 with a response to the Great Recession. But if you look at the trend over time from 2008 all the way down to 2032, what you'll see is that in most areas, the spending on children is not scheduled to go up. Unlike other parts of the budget, particularly those parts of the budget that have automatic growth, which are mainly Social Security and healthcare, which have tremendous growth built in them. Spending on children doesn't. There is, if you look really closely, there's some modest growth in health spending on children, but children's healthcare is really not that expensive to begin with. So part of the conclusion of this Kids Share is that basically kids have never been a priority in the federal budget. They did participate a bit in some modest growth in real spending, even a modest growth as a share of GDP, but that took place while defense spending declined from about 50% of the federal budget to about 15%. So what happened is they got a tiny bit of increased share of that pie, but only a tiny bit. So at least from this type of graphic, you see that kids have not been a priority in the budget, but you also see, and it's going to come up again in my talk, and I believe in what the comments we might get from my compatriots here, is that the way the system is indexed is kids are scheduled to be a reduced share of the budget, reduced share of GDP to have great spending and tax subsidies for children. So let me turn quickly to the major tax provisions affecting children. And they really serve three purposes, all of which, in my view, are valid. The oldest is the adjustment for ability to pay. If you go back to 1960, there were really only two major provisions in the outlay and the tax system that affected children. That was AFDC, federal level, it was AFDC on the spending side, and on the tax side, the dependent exemption. The dependent exemption, by the way, being the dominant item. But the dependent exemption has long been in the tax system as a zero tax rate base, which basically allows for an adjustment for family size. Now, some people say, well, why should we adjust for family size? But then you think about it in welfare, it's like you don't want to give a family of 3 or 4 the same amount of benefit you give a family of 1 or 2, because they just have greater needs. But the same thing applies to the tax system. If you have a larger family, your ability to pay tax is less. And so there's long been an attempt to make some adjustment in the tax system for ability to pay. And by the way, it doesn't have to affect progressively at all. You can always tax 2 people with $100,000, say the same amount, and adjust how much the one with children versus doesn't have children, and still collect the same amount from them. So it's not really an issue of progressivity, except when you start attacking the issue one at a time. You say, why don't we spend more on, say, something else, and therefore I'm going to take something from family for children. If you go on from, in terms of that system, the greatest erosion of the tax base from about 46 to 1980 was actually the erosion of the dependent exemption over time, and with inflation, real growth of wages, and so on and so forth. And that decline, actually, there was a brief build up during tax reform that Josh mentioned. I was involved in a bit. That also has eroded over time. Now, the second major purpose of the tax provisions affecting children is to provide work incentives. The work incentives are mainly reflected in their income credit, which was offered in 75 mainly as an alternative to increasing AFDC, or what was then thought of as the classic welfare. Now, there's something about the PFDC, as well as other means-tested programs, is at the end of the day, relative to the more universal programs, they're relatively cheap. The ITC is also relatively cheap because it really gives very little benefit to workers who don't have children, so the childless is, for the most part, excluded from the credit. And it turns out from the way it's phased out, it offers very little to married couples, because if you have 2 modest earning individuals as a couple, as a married couple, they quickly phase out of any benefit they could get. So EITC has been increased somewhat over time since the mid-90s. Its share of GDP is about the same today as it was in the past. It's been declining as a share of GDP in recent years. And then the third item that we want to talk about, our subject today, is the child credit. Well, as I say, the EITC was both a provision for supporting work, but it only mainly went to families and children. So it really sort of served both purposes. The child credit is directly aimed at providing an adjustment or as a subsidy for raising children. And is largely thought of, unlike the dependent exemption, it's largely thought of as a subsidy. I remember my daughter, who's middle income, saying, why am I getting this child credit in the mail every year? I don't need it like other families do. But when she had a dependent exemption, it was adjustment for ability to pay tax. She didn't think about it. So the child credit, even though it now has substituted for the dependent exemption in 2017, when the Republicans enacted the tax jobs the Jobs Act in 2017, they basically eliminated the dependent exemption and let the child credit now serve both purposes, which is this help at the bottom, which Bob's going to talk a lot about, but also it still substituted for the dependent exemption. Now, this raises a lot of interesting issues that, in terms of the conflict of the child credit. If you think of it as a subsidy for children, you might think, well, let's just concentrate at the bottom. Let's make it look like welfare, but then that takes away from the issue of whether you should also have subsidies for wages. The earned income credit is a subsidy for wages as well as a child credit. The dependent exemption actually was an adjustment for ability to pay tax. So the child credit sort of gets in the mix of these programs. The debate over the child credit largely sometimes goes back and forth whether you think it's supposed to help people in terms of a job subsidy. At one time, it was oriented to phase in like their income credit, whether you think it's a subsidy for children, particularly at low income levels, whether you think it's actually supposed to be an adjustment for ability to pay tax. If you look back to the Rockefeller Commission proposal of having $1,000 tax credit, and you adjust that for wages, not just price, instead if you said it would keep up with, say, median or average wages, that $1,000 credit, by the way, would be about $3,000 today. It would not, in fact, be more than $3,000. So what happens with the dependent exemption also now happens with the child credit. It's not even adjusted for inflation, or particularly real growth in average wages. So it declines over time. And in fact, one of the little tricks in the Tax Cuts and Job Act of 2017 was that child credit is unindexed, the dependent exemption was indexed. So long run, that act actually provided that over time, the tax provisions for children would decline in real terms over time, and there would be less support. So later discussion, and perhaps later, even during the rest of this talk, we'll have some discussion about how well should all of these different provisions serve these different purposes. In my view, all those purposes, adjusting for ability to pay tax, adjustment because we want to help families, low income levels to have adequate income to support, particularly to eliminate poverty, and the extent to which you want to actually subsidize work. To me, they're all legitimate efforts. The question is whether you can try to rely on any one of these instruments to serve all three purposes. And I look forward to the comments of my colleagues for a further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob, I noted earlier your initial emphasis on refundability when folks were starting to talk about the child tax credit. Can you walk us through your thinking then and now and where you think it should go?
Sure. Thanks to Niskanen for inviting me. Finally, I have a new paper actually on the child tax credit just out yesterday. There were a few copies that were on there. So it's also on the Hamilton Project and looking at websites. I'd like to thank the Rockefeller Foundation for providing a wonderful venue for me to write the paper. I wrote the first draft of the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio this summer. So what a great place to be. I have long thought that the child credit would be most effective if it were fully refundable, as the National Commission on Children recommended. But of course, when the credit was created in 1997, it was not refundable. And millions of children in working poor families who didn't earn enough to owe federal income tax were entirely shut out, as well many other children in destitute families that had no earnings. In 2001, the child tax credit took a step forward, and it adopted what really has been, except for 2021, its structure since then, basically, as a partially refundable credit that phases in slowly without certain earnings threshold and level. But that current structure falls very far short in crucial ways, in my opinion. So today, I'm using Tax Policy Center data here. The credit provides nothing or only a partial credit to nearly 19 million children, 19 million of the poorest children in the country, because their parents lack earnings or their earnings are too low. To receive the full $2,000 credit per child for all children in the family, a married couple with 2 children has to have earnings of nearly $36,000. That's more than twice what a full-time job at the federal minimum wage pays. Even as affluent families with incomes as high as $400,000 get the full credit for all of their children. But today, 28% of children under 17 get no credit or only a partial credit because the families have low earnings and no earnings. 28% of all children, 45% of Black children, 39% of Latino children, and nearly 700,000 children in families with a veteran or an active duty military member also get no credit or only a partial credit because of their family's low earnings. Now, that the exclusion and fuller in part of the poorest children is not sound policy is underscored I think, by a growing body of research on poverty's effects on children, as well as by the credit's track record of 2021 when it was fully refundable for 1 year. Research persuasively demonstrates that poverty can adversely affect children's health, their educational attainment, and their earnings as adults, and that income support for low-income families with children improves children's health, educational attainment, and their employment and earnings prospects in adulthood. And research also shows that the fully refundable expanded credit in effect in 2021 reduced child poverty dramatically, substantially reduced food insecurity among children, these other hardships, and did all of these things without, as multiple studies now show, without leading parents to leave the workforce or the workforce. Of particular importance, in my view, are some things that my Brookings colleagues, Bill Gale and Ian Berlin, pointed out in a recent child tax credit piece, and I want to quote a couple of things they said. They said, quote, "The effects of being poor are so severe. The children raised in poverty have significantly less gray matter brain development, leading to permanent differences in educational outcomes." Gale and Berlin also emphasized that any effects of a fully refundable child credit on parental employment over a longer period are, and I'm quoting them again, uncertain and likely to be small. Their conclusion, and to me, this is the bottom line, is, quote, "With the costs of raising children in poverty being so great, and the lifelong benefits of even small cash allowances being so significant, expanding the credit to the poorest children should be seen as a bargain." We're talking about bargains. Joint Tax Committee estimated last year that full refundability, this is in the 2001, that full refundability costs only $12 billion a year. We're used to hearing the much higher cost figures for the child credit expansion in the American estimate. Those much higher figures stem not from the full refundability, but from increasing substantially the dollar amount per child for most of the children in the United States. So I'll conclude with a few comments on where we are now. As you all know, we're looking forward to possible congressional negotiations in the next several weeks over a possible year-end tax. To me, the highest priority for the child credit in such negotiations should be full refundability. I also recognize that any year-end tax legislation will require 60 Senate votes. So if full refundability for all of the children turns out not to be attainable now, then the priority, in my view, should be to move the credit as far as possible toward full refundability, to do as much as possible to help low-income children, such as one, phasing in the credit much more quickly with earnings, as a proposal from Senator Romney would do. Two, making the credit fully refundable for very young children, where there is less expectation that their parents should be working, and for children whose caretaker is elderly or has a work-limiting disability. And three, allowing a low-income filer to use earnings in either the tax year or the prior year for child credit purposes, so children aren't penalized because their working parent or guardian has a temporary vow of unemployment. And I would urge that any such improvements be made without cutting other important supports for low-income children.
And Elaine, Jean referred to this as sort of a growing alphabet soup of CTC, EITC, CCDC, all sorts of family tax expenditures over time since the 1970s. Can you sort of walk us through where we are today? And in these conversations, there's some subtle differences that can have a big impact. Can you chat a bit about those?
Sure, so all those alphabet letters are what keep me in business, explaining to people how all of these programs intersect. And I think what I would just say is that we ought to be really clear about what we want our tax policies to do. And we should design tax policies that do just that. And I'm very sympathetic to Jean's remark that we've sort of stretched these things to cover so much. You know, even the child credit now, is it an adjustment for family size, or is it a welfare inducing program? So we have a big mishmash of policies, and I think what I want to do is sort of talk about generally where that lands us. So one might ask, why do we have so many family subsidies in the tax system? And I think the answer is because it was politically feasible. But there's also a reason we like subsidies in the tax system. As intimidating as the federal tax system is, it's also a place that touches almost everyone, almost every year. And so it's efficient both for families claiming benefits, but also administrators delivering benefits. And so we put these benefits in the tax system. And in many ways, that's increased the take-up rates. So more eligible families receive tax benefits than other types of support programs. So that's a good thing about it. And then I also want to recognize that this group of programs, along with the traditional transfer programs, have done a lot to reduce child poverty. So there's real signs they're working. You see this steady drop in child poverty over time until it sort of levels out at about 10%. Then last year, the child tax credit gets expanded to these very low income families that used to be excluded from the credit, and poverty's cut by another, about 40%. And then we watch it bounce right back up. And so they're by and large working, but they're clunky. So in some cases, people are not eligible for their benefits. So the child care credit, which you would think would help deliver child care to families, in fact, it goes to people that look exactly like me, and it goes to no one who is very low income, except for in 2021. It doesn't get paid at a time when it would be useful for low income families who face income constraints, because you first have to pay your child care provider. They expect to be paid weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. And then after a year or so of doing this, the tax system will return some money to you. So it doesn't really enhance the quality of care people are getting or the amount of care, because it's targeted benefits on people who are upper middle income. It doesn't have a phase out, so very high income families can even benefit. So if we want a program that helps put families, children in centers of care that are low income, we would need to do a lot of work to change that credit, to make it advanced and refundable. And that sort of brings me to the two issues that I see with all the subsidies in the tax system. The first is that it's a very blunt tool. So by that, I mean eligibility is determined annually, and your family is determined once per year. But we know that's not how people live their lives. So long ago, not that long ago, maybe 20 years ago, we thought these annual benefits were quite fantastic. They provided families an opportunity to have a relatively large sum of cash that they could make important investments in. The research showed they were buying used cars, refrigerators, really making investments, maybe moving to a better neighborhood even. But then we sort of see more and more programs piled into the tax system. And so I start to wonder, is an annual benefit really the right way to go? And I get a lot of pushback from my more senior colleagues that it is the right way to go, but I am quite convinced that it's not suitable. So families are not low income because they have low income jobs all throughout the year. They're low income because they're coming in and out of the labor market. So roughly 40% of families have 6 months of the year, low income families, where their income is 25% above or below their average throughout the year. So incomes are bouncing around wildly. So that to me speaks to needing a steady source of income. And then in 2021, it's as if Congress had been listening and they started delivering these payments monthly. And some research that I did at the Urban Institute with our Wellbeing and Basic Needs Survey with Michael Hartman, we asked folks, what did you think about those monthly payments? We know from a lot of data sources that food insecurity dropped, people reported paying down debt, better meeting their family's needs. But it turns out that a plurality of people, particularly low-income families, wanted those monthly payments to continue. And I think they want those monthly payments to continue because people have so many monthly obligations, and a steady stream of payments allows you to meet those. So I think looking forward from here, we need to figure out a way to deliver benefits that are contemporaneous with need. That goes for childcare benefits, it goes for cash subsidies. It doesn't mean we have to deliver everything as a monthly payment, but there should be something delivered as a monthly payment. Otherwise, I think what we do is we lift people out of poverty in February and March, and by May, they're right back there. And I don't think that benefits children. The second issue is, so the timing of the payments is the first. The second issue that makes these programs not as good as they can be is they determine family annually, and they assume a child belongs to exactly one family, and that's just not the case. So a third of children today live in a single parent home, and that's due to a lot of things. People are marrying later, there's declining marriage rates, increasing divorce rates, and more babies are being born outside of wedlock. And so all of those forces are not going to change with some policy overnight. And so we need to recognize that kids are in single parent families. 15 million of those kids, so about 2/3, are in a household that's a mom and a single mother. 6 million of them are in cohabitating households. So both a mom and dad are likely present, they're just not married. And then the last 3 or 4 million are in father-only households. But if you ask anyone in the child welfare world, should we only support the household the child lives in most of the year? They would say no. Children do better when there's co-parenting. And in fact, shared custody arrangements are the most common arrangements for families today. And so the tax system needs to do a little catching up and figuring out how do you support multiple households that are providing support to a single child to sort of recognize this co-parenting role that's happening. The other thing is if a child is moving between households in a traditional transfer program, if I'm receiving food stamp benefits, the benefits can move with the child. It doesn't happen with the child tax credit or the EITC or the child care credit. It goes to just one family. And so that's something that I think we can have our eyes on and figure out how to make that better. And it might be splitting benefits, or it might be determining benefits in shorter than annual periods. I've seen sort of talk of both. So the sense I have now is that the child tax credit debate is mired in this employment question. The child tax credit, in my mind, is a subsidy for children. We should focus the conversation on the benefits to children. If we had a policy that wasn't trying to tangle itself up with employment, we could do that. We can leave the earned income tax credit to do all the employment work we need it to do. And we can have a child benefit that focuses just on children. And it would be wrong not to suggest that, Bob and Jean have done an extraordinary amount of work on all of this, which sort of allows me to stand on their shoulders and try to continue that discussion forward.
Thank you. So we've covered a lot today, and I think we've seen a lot of this in the history of the child tax credit where different people see different things in the credit. So what I want to do is try to connect those with the technical parts of the credit. You guys are well versed in it, but there's a lot of levers to pull with the child tax credit and some of these other credits. What I want to do is sort of go through different policy goals, and if you have any ideas on what aspect of the child tax credit or other tax credits would be useful to think about for that goal, you can jump in and talk about it. So the first one a lot of people allude to is the child tax credit as an anti-poverty tool. So if we're thinking of it that way, how should we be thinking about it?
So I'm a fan of more universal benefits and picking up the increasing taxes at the high end to claw it back that way. And so it allows you to advance the credit without worry. And you can have those poverty fighting, power without then worrying that too much of the credit is going to bleed out to households that you think don't need it. So you can raise the rates on the back end, provide, a near universal benefit or a universal benefit. That to me is simple. That of course is politically impossible, which someone else can tackle.
This is somebody in keeping with where Elaine's suggestion. The child credit, because it now is more universal, does not phase out completely. Long time ago, I did a study with Linda Gianarelli. We titled the study "The Twice Poverty Trap." So it turns out if you get wages, you start earning income, you actually do okay with the tax and the various abuse tester programs. When you get up to about poverty level, or a little above there, all of a sudden you face these often very high marginal tax rates. Now, in truth, the exchange subsidies in healthcare actually help reduce those relative to Medicaid. When you earn another dollar, and technically you lost your Medicaid, but nonetheless they're very high. And so, to me, to answer your question, if you ask about the child credit, I like the fact that it's more universal, partly because I don't have just another program that's going to phase out along with all the other. If you're asking what I would do in some broader set of reforms, I would really work on these things together. If you look at the size of government, my calculations are if you count all the tax subsidies, count federal and state, local, we spend about 40% of GDP. That means one way or the other, we're collecting 40% of GDP. Now, we might be imposing it on the young with that. We might be doing it through the back door, such as the fact that we have these negative interest rates and bondholders. But nonetheless, we're imposing this high tax rate. So we need to think about, in a very broad sense, about how to have that phase in over time. I'm going to be a little technical here. It turns out in the tax system, as you phase in, for a lot of married couples who face big marriage penalties, when they're just above poverty, when they get a bit above that, they get towards middle income levels, all of a sudden they get a lot of subsidies typically from the tax system, especially if they have unequal earnings. So that can sort of offset. So I guess I would like to think about these systems as a whole and how do we think about these phase in tax rates. The other thing that I'd want to do in line with this is I really think we need to beef up wage subsidies substantially. I think we need to have the return for wage earners always to be sitting somewhere above the return, dodging the issue of disabilities in other cases, but generally speaking, to be above the return for say, a non-wage earner. And you need to make sure that that happens fairly far along the income distribution. So I'm very much in favor of thinking we've left our wage earners out of our broad social welfare system for some time now. We need to really look at that.
All right. I make two comments. Poverty reductions. I think it's any question. Single most important feature would be full refundability. Yes. And this also connects to something Elaine was. If you want to do monthly payments, it's much easier to do them if there's full refundability. If you continue to have a credit that phases into earnings, then you can have a lot of errors in the monthly payments because income moves all over the place. I think it would make sense to essentially retain the earned income credit, which varies within these, as a once a year payment, while having a fully refundable child credit that, as in 2021, is monthly. I differ a little with Elaine. I'm not sure if I'll differ with she and I'll differ here or not.
That could be confusing.
I'm not in favor at this point of making the credit, child credit, fully universal all the way to the top of the income scale. And the reason for that is simply that I think doing that actually makes it harder, not easier, but harder to do well for low-income kids because of the price. So if you think about the American Rescue, way before we got to Joe Manchin, the Build Back Better bill, even when it was a $3.5 trillion, did not make the big increase in the dollar amount for kid in the American Rescue because the price tag was more than politically making. When we go back to the Laurel Bennett Brown American Family Act of 2019, which was a big child credit expansion movement, it began to phase out its credit, or it phased out its credit at about $200,000 a year. Why did they not go higher? Because they thought that going higher would be a political negative, not a political positive, because the higher cost would add to the difficulty of getting the votes to get it through Congress. So I agree with you. The child credit should not be a narrow means tested program just focused on low income. I think for political reasons, it's very important to include most middle income kids in it. But to me, what the American Family Act would have done, phasing out around 200,000, I think that goes high. It's not discussable now, especially given Republicans don't want to raise taxes on anyone. Democrats don't want to touch anybody more than $400,000 a year. So this isn't something that's coming up anywhere in the near term. But I wouldn't favor making it fully universal, at least not until we have a robust, fully refundable credit that's safe for the long term. And even then, I think there'd probably be higher priorities for children, dollar to dollar, and covering people with high 6 or 7 figure incomes.
So my response there is more theoretical. Politically, I think you're right, Bob. That if you start giving child credit high income, especially now that people view it as a subsidy, not an adjustment for ability to pay tax. We didn't have that adjustment for most of its history. But now that it's viewed as a subsidy for children, yes, it's going, people are going to say, why do we want to give this to high income people? I mentioned my daughter is one example. They said, why am I getting this credit when she had no issue at all with the independent exemption? I do worry about the extent to which that's going to continue to erode down to middle income levels. Because I do think even say at $50,000 or $100,000 of income, a family with say 3 children has a lot less ability to pay tax than one that has no children. And I think that some adjustment there is appropriate. And you and I know that if we're talking about progressivity, there's a lot of other ways of getting that progressivity other than taking the money away from the people that have kids in order to support the low income families with kids. If we take it away from everybody. So I agree with you politically in terms of what you could do at the top, but I really do worry about that focus that takes away from the focus that the tax system should adjust for family size really starts eroding not just the benefits to middle income people, but actually in the long run can even erode middle income support for the child credit itself. But it wouldn't if we index around the region. I'm just saying down the road, I feel like the policy could keep pushing in that direction. It seems to me you want to get the right policy and then you want to convince.
So the big thing I was struck in reading your early work in the Analyst Commission was the child tax credit as a pro-work policy, as an alternative to AFTC at the time. Looked very different. The earned income tax credit looked very different. So we fast forward now. How should we think about the child tax credit in terms of making sure it doesn't penalize work or incentivizes work or that?
But I think the simple question, and part of the problem is we always examine these programs one at a time. Because we've been lucky enough to be in a growing economy, we're spending more and more every year. Even if share of GDP doesn't go up, as I mentioned, 40% of GDP is a lot of money. Not counting state level, counting everything, it's a lot of money. My calculations are that we now provide something like $65,000 to $70,000 of spending in tax subsidies per household. And in a few decades, it's going to be 100,000. So to me, it's part of what I'm trying to write in the book. We should be thinking about what do we want to do with that extra 30,000? And I don't think government's going to become that much smaller. Maybe it will. So maybe it's 25,000, 20,000. So to me, you can do a lot of things without always worrying about what you're going to take it away from. And in fact, if we start providing things like a child credit, it's very possible that we would spend a little less money on, say, TANF. So in fact, Bob's probably overstating the cost of making the child credit refundable, because there's probably some offsets over time in what some other programs provide. So we give them the child credit. Maybe we don't need to bump up food stamps as much. Maybe we need to bump up something else. So to me, when you take the big picture into account, I think the arguments for the child credit at the bottom are pretty high.
That's what we think about work incentives.
So But also, I say I would, again, in the long run, I would design this, especially in working families. The child credit is so modest, I mean, $2,000 per child. I mean, even if you think that is a disincentive to work, it's just not that much. Anybody's raising a child, it's not gonna go very far in terms of supporting, your lifestyle. So, I mean, it's so modest at this point. Yes, at high enough levels that you can provide work incentives. Social Security and Medicare have led to people retiring 13 years earlier than they used to. And that is at some point a disincentive, but they're operating at levels of tens of thousands of dollars of support, not at a few $1,000s. So I think whatever work disincentive is there, I think would probably be offset by just the support the family had of being able to the anti-poverty provisions aspects which Elaine talked about helping them get out of poverty and all the benefits that has. And Bob too.
I just think not every program has to try to accomplish every laudable goal. The child credit doesn't need to also function as a working center. The earned income credit does. Hey, the earned income credit is from working center. But the child credit is something that, especially given this growing body of research on the adverse effects of poverty on kids, positive long-term, not just immediate effects, income support, focus the child credit particularly on that, but other programs be the ones that deal with the important issues. That would be.
So I did some work last year with Kevin Warner, who's here today, and others, and we interviewed moms who were on TANF and sort of asked them, what kind of incentives or disincentives to work do you face? What's going to happen to your benefits if your income, if your earnings change? And by and large, mothers are saying, we would like to go to work, but to do that, we need a safe place for our children to spend the day. And we need to be able to actually find a job instead of spend all of our time trying to make basic needs met. And so there is, some argument out there that even providing a credit like the child tax credit in 2021 that did not have a phase in can still function to help people move into the labor force, because I know I can meet my childcare needs. I am not spending so much time scrambling just to make my daily life work. And I think that needs to not get lost in this debate. So that, coupled with what Bob's saying about how there's real harm happening to millions of kids who are living in very, very low income households. And it needs to be addressed immediately. It's very costly not to do so.
Also note, the census pulse data shows that in 2021, a non-trivial share of low-income families fully responsible child care used at least in part for child care. But I don't know, this is a pure speculation. There are multiple studies that Elaine was co-author of, at least one of the things, two of them, that found that could not find any significant reduction in employment. So a speculation is it could be that some small number, among some small number, there was a reduction, but that among others, there was an increase in employment because of the ability of the venerable child to what was perceived as adequate quality child, and that those two effects could have offset each other, giving you kind of a null result overall. So, I think Elaine's point is a really critical one. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that one of the potential benefits of the child credit is the ability of the people to afford child care that actually helps them out with more.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to save some time for audience questions. So we'll open it up. If you can say your name and then loudly ask your question. It could be to the panel, it could be to a specific person, but there's no microphone needed. You should be able to hear you.
Matt Darling. So we're talking about the history of the CTC, and I think we're at this sort of interesting historical moment where they expanded it, and for the first time it went down. If you look at the history of it, it had always been going up and up and up and up, and then it went down. I was wondering if there's sort of any other historical parallels where people thought that there was going to be an expansion and it just didn't happen? Or, are there any lessons that we can learn from that history?
There are lots of examples of programs that were expanded on a temporary basis during recessions and then came back to their prior limits. But not in the credits. So actually, if you look at the 2009 Recovery Act, it only measures social program expansions in the act originally enacted on a temporary basis that then were made permanent were the tax credit improvements, the EITC, the child credit, and the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And everything that was on the spending side as opposed to the tax side did indeed end as the economy improved or whenever the expiration date of the Recovery Act occurred and did not come back. It's kind of interesting, not surprising. Tax cuts do better than spending increases.
So, the way you phrased the question implied whether policy changes enacted by Congress would make a difference, but the main thing that affects the growth and the decline in various programs is the way they're indexed. So Social Security and healthcare programs are indexed particular ways. I'm not going to go into details. I'd rather you understand about it. They're indexed to grow forever faster than GDP, which is one reason that they keep growing independently of congressional actions. The dependent exemption, as I mentioned earlier, had this huge decline after World War II. In fact, it was the major tax-based expansion over anything else in the entire post-war period. The child credit now is not indexed for inflation, so it's scheduled to decline. What happens to it over time is largely, for an unindexed system, is largely dependent upon legislation. Now, I'm not arguing, by the way, that everything should be indexed to grow faster than GDP, because then we get all sorts of budget problems. I think in fact we need to limit how much things are indexed, but we should have them on some sort of on a level playing field. But bottom line, the hills and the valleys in these various programs largely depend upon how they're indexed, and less so, especially in the modern era, less so on congressional actions.
So I was stunned when the child tax credit expansion was not extended. Maybe I am naive, but I was stunned. And my experience was that even when we tried to clean up the tax code a little bit, things don't go away. And my example is we have these flexible spending accounts. You can put money in them and use that money to pay your child care on a pre-tax basis. And we have a child dependent care tax credit. And so for a long time, if you had 2 or more kids, you would put $5,000 in your FSA if your employer offered one. And then you would go pick up $1,000 of child care credit. And it was just ridiculous. It's like extra paperwork. It makes no sense. Even my husband, who works for the government, was confused. And he was like, why do you design programs this way? Well, in one of the Obama budgets, the FSA was taken out to get a little bit of money. I think it was even going to be sprinkled around more progressively. And within 24 hours, that thing was back in. Like it was. And I was like, if we're going to protect a program like a flexible spending account, it's an alternative, we will never clean out anything. So it was shocking to me that we would, watch these families report, all these good things are happening, and then it was just gone. I didn't think it could happen.
I do think, among other things, the price tag is back in the use. I didn't expect it. And the reason was, that would have been over $1 trillion over 10 years.
Spending on children did decline after the Great Recession as well. Some programs do not get the expansion. I think SNAP actually, had some decline. Maybe not SNAP, but a couple of the other ones certainly didn't have the benefits that they temporarily provided.
If you go back to late 60s, late 70s, social programs, including targeted immune systems, on the whole, not counted, have expanded considerably over that period. But the expansion is an increase. And I do think that there is a reasonable chance that over some number of years, I'm not sure how long it will take, that we could get back to something perhaps like the American Rescue Plan, piece of the child credit. But if so, I think that will be in several increments over some number of years, largely. I could be wrong. If there is, I mean, at some point, if there were a Democratic trifecta, I know that's significant margins in the Senate maybe. But I do think the price tag might be that this occurs several increments rather than all at once.
Hi, Kevin Warner. So I was wondering, and I've talked to Elaine about this, she knows my thoughts, but I was wondering, I think one of the big shames of the fact that the child tax credit did not get expanded, the expanded child tax credit did not get extended, sorry, is that in addition to the fact of the failure of the extension, is that our debate is about if we should do it or not, and not how to make the expanded child tax credit better. I think one of the big things that people should be concerned about, or that I'm concerned about, is the take-up rate among people who don't usually file taxes. I think we don't have very good data on that, and I think even most of our modeling is based on assumptions that people will get all the credits that they are that they qualify for. I think there's some data from the Pulse survey that kind of gets at the take-up rate, but it's not great. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on if in some optimistic future we are able to get a fully refundable child tax credit. Again, what do you think can be done to make sure that all the people who are eligible for it, especially those who don't usually file taxes, are able to get it?
I think long run, we have desperate need to build an administrative system that deals with this issue. And I'm not sure whether that's entirely ours doing on its own. These will be working with the state in terms of programs that are already coordinated. In Europe, whether you like their systems or not, they basically, a lot of their child subsidies are not in the tax system. And the child allowances tend to come out of the spending program. So they have, registries or other things like that to try to identify the children. I think we've got a lot of work to do on the administrative side. And one of the problems with not deciding whether we're going to make it like it's a permanent part of the system or not, is we're not working on the administrative side. And I can see the GAO studies coming out, 4 or 5 years from now. So not only that we missed out on a lot of people, but actually some people maybe were able to play the system and get benefits they shouldn't have had. So I think you're raising a major issue, and I don't see much work taking place right now within the government to solve that. So I looked at this a bit in the paper I just read. The data suggests that in 2021, especially on December, the monthly payments, if you include people who opted out of the monthly payments and then received the credit, the child credit reached about 90% of the kids eligible for it. There's a new study that I've just seen the abstract, not the study. It's a study that has an estimated 92%. However, there's no question that the take-up rate is lower among people at the bottom of the family. And I've not seen a good estimate of that. I saw an estimate from one study that I thought we couldn't trust because it was based purely on people's recalls reported in the survey, and we know there's always big underreported. I do think there are things that could be done. So one, for example, when the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act took place, there was a mechanism provided, made available as an option, whereby states could electronically screen their SNAP case loads, identify people on the Medicaid, almost automatically. In this case, what I'd like to see, particularly if there's a fully refundable child, is you could have the federal government make modest, it wouldn't be that modest grants to states, probably their administrative costs, to have states run their Medicaid and SNAP roles and provide a roster of children in those programs by Social Security number to the federal government, which would then match it against, say, the most recent year's roster of who got the child tax credit.
try and identify those children who are showing up as being on Medicaid or SNAP, but not getting the credit, and have the federal government provide them some easy tool. So it wouldn't mean you would get the money, you'd still miss a bunch of those people, but I think that I've seen the idea suggested of when children are born in the hospital and they're doing Social Security enumeration at birth, linking that right in some kind of child tax credit registry. I think there are a number of things that could be done, although they have to kick both agencies to get SSA and IRS to coordinate more closely in order to better identify and notify kids. And some of these things will have to be tested, and we learn the results, and we learn what worked and what didn't. Like if you did this Medicaid SNAP thing, my guess is the first time you did it, you would produce positive results with a variety of glitches that you want to learn from before you move into the subsequent. But I do think you're absolutely right. If full refundability does become the ongoing policy, it really should be coupled with some mechanisms to strengthen take-up. And I'd add, the IRS did do a good job on that portal it provided. You didn't even have to put income information in, right? Because it was fully refundable. You just had to attest that you were below the income level at which you're required by federal law to file income tax anyway. So I do think there are things to build on that were done in 2021, but a number of additional things, some of which weren't done in 2021 because it would take too long to put them in place, and you'd already be right out of the end of 2021. If we do it on an ongoing basis, we should invest in my view, in these kinds of.
And Nina Olson talks a lot about, we have to make the IRS a customer service agency. And I think back to a call, David Harris with some administrators in Canada. And they're like, let me tell you this story about how we went into these communities where nobody was claiming a child benefit and now everyone is, and they love us and we're the heroes. And they're tax people. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And so it can be done. It's done in other places. We just have to, fund the agency adequately, make it part of their mission. And I really agree with both of you. You are saying that it needs to be an ongoing program. It is absolutely unfair to families to keep dropping them in and out of eligibility for benefits and expecting them to, catch up with what's happening.
Just a footnote, we need also to build an administrative system. What I think is now going to happen again, because it's now happening in the Great Recession and COVID, which is how do we deal with the fact that we try to bump up benefits, a lot of benefits during some sort of downturn. And do we really have the structures in place to do it? We should be able to learn from us to experiences doing that, because you do want to have some benefits that bump up at a recession and then fall back down. And we need to build that administrative apparatus as well.
So we are bumping up against time, so this will be the end of the formal conversation here. But what we're going to do now is we'll take a break. We're going to continue the conversation during that break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to start our second panel of the great set of panelists that Sam Hammond will be running. So during the break, we'll chat, sign up for your newsletter, read Bob's paper, and just chat with Elaine. So thank you guys. I really appreciate you all coming out for this.